Student loan forgiveness has become an incredibly popular idea.
We have a moral obligation, an economic obligation, a political obligation to cancel student loan debt.
But Michael Burry himself has been warning about the scary reality of this student loan forgiveness, going so far as to say it will have terrible consequences for America. I'm going to explain why in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over inflationary pressure. Inflation has been a big part of our lives for the last 2 years, and student loan forgiveness might make it worse. Let's start by going over a chart that goes all the way back to 2014 to today's date. On the left, we go from 10 trillion up to $24 trillion. This is M2 money supply. I want to focus on this big red circle right in the middle, where the actual number of currency units, as measured by this metric, went up by 25% from 2020 just to the end of 2021. A staggering amount. So staggering, in fact, I've got the Macaulay Culkin stick figure right here doing his Home Alone pose. Editor, go ahead and help me out with that. So the main thing I want to point out is this is one of the main reasons we have had such severe consumer price inflation that has disproportionately impacted the poor and middle class over the last couple years. Also, we had the government, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, come in and lock everyone in a cage, which disrupted every single global supply chain. And this also contributed to the massive amount of inflation. But right now, we're going to focus on the amount of currency units, the amount of dollars circulating, chasing goods and services. So the next question becomes why? Why did we see such a dramatic increase? We all know there was government deficit spending and stimmy checks and PPP. But if they're just borrowing the dollars through issuing bonds, treasuries, or if they're just taxing people, that's really not increasing the amount of currency units. So what inflationary brew was concocted to make M2 money supply go up to that degree? Okay, well, we've got to start with quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve. So let's go right back to the whiteboard. We've got the Federal Reserve here. Start off with their balance sheet, assets on the left, liabilities on the right. Same thing for the commercial bank and the average Joe. Now, in this scenario, he's going to represent the non-bank entities in the real economy. And each balance sheet is blank except for Joe, and he's got an asset treasury. Okay, well, the next step is the Fed comes in and does quantitative easing during 2020 and 2021. So how does this work? Well, the Fed comes in and through the primary dealer banks buys that asset from Joe. So this treasury goes from his balance sheet over to the Fed. Well, how do they pay for that? They create funny money, fugazis, bank reserves. These are assets of the commercial banks, and that's a liability to the Fed. That's why we've got this red dollar sign indicating that it's not really a dollar circulating here. It's more so just on the Fed's balance sheet, dollar-denominated bank reserves. Okay, so that is an asset of the commercial bank, and then they're going to go ahead and credit the average Joe's account for the amount of the treasury. But notice what has happened. The amount of quote-unquote money in the system has increased. This is exactly what happened during this big red circle right in the middle. When you combine this with an extension of loans, specifically lines of credit, because of the cerveza sickness, all of these businesses went to their local bank. They were worried for obvious reasons, and they said, let me draw down that line of credit. So when you combine the line of credit drawdowns, the extension of credit, the additional extension of credit with quantitative easing, that is where you get M2 money supply increasing by 25% in a little over a year. And you may be saying to yourself right now, okay, George, I get it, but what does this have to do with this student loan forgiveness? And that's a great question. We're going to answer that throughout the rest of this video. Step number 2, student loan forgiveness equals more debt, which equals more quantitative easing, which equals, you guessed it, more consumer price inflation. Let's start by going over a chart that goes back to 1970 all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 trillion all the way up to $32 trillion with a T. This is government debt. So we start off, it kind of flatlines. In the 1980s, it goes up significantly. Then, as most of you know, in the late 1990s, the government actually ran a surplus. They had more revenue coming in than they had expenses. I mean, it's hard to believe in today's day and age. But as we know, in the early 2000s, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam started spending money again like the drunken sailor he is. So the debt starts to go up, really skyrockets during the GFC when we had all the bailouts. Then during Obama, Trump, it continues to go up at a significant degree. Then we get to the cerveza sickness where it goes straight up, parabolic. And since that time, it's absolutely skyrocketed. So just like we did in step number 1, I want to focus on this red line, or this red circle, excuse me. And this is where debt went from $24 trillion. And then just a year and a half, 2 years later, it was 31 trillion. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. That's an increase of 29%. So during this time frame, approximately, M2 money supply goes up by 25%, and government debt goes up by almost 30%. And this is one of the main reasons the Fed came in and did quantitative easing in the first place. Because let's think this through. As the government is deficit spending to this degree, what are they doing? They're issuing more and more treasuries. Well, it's simple supply and demand. If the supply of treasuries explodes and the demand doesn't keep pace, then the price will go down. Well, you guys know there's an inverse relationship between the price of the treasury and the yield, the interest rate. So if prices are going down, yields are going up. And during the cerveza sickness in 2021, that's the opposite of what the Fed wanted them to do. They wanted to keep interest rates, especially at the long end, very low, to keep the cost of mortgages low, to keep the cost of credit card debt low, to keep the cost of auto loans as low as possible. But now let's fast forward to today. And editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of who the net buyer has been for treasuries over the past year and a half. And we can see it's the U.S. retail investor. Pretty much all other entities have been net sellers of treasuries. So what this means moving forward is if the U.S. retail buyer backs out and stops buying treasuries, the Fed might be the only game in town, meaning they might be the only buyer. Okay, so let's take it to the next step. If we do this student loan forgiveness, that means that the majority of the assets on the government's balance sheet, poof, simply go away. And even if they buy that student loan debt to forgive it, let's say it's on the bank's balance sheet, they still have to issue more debt. But let's assume for a moment, let's focus on the student loans that are actually on the balance sheet of the federal government. Well, how would that work? Well, it's actually very simple. Right now, we've got student Stu right here, and he is paying the government, and the government takes those dollars and gives it to Grandpa Joe. That's having a hard time with his back here. You can see he's got a cane, and he's picking up his Social Security checks. Okay, well, if we go ahead and forgive student Stu's loans, then he is going to keep that money for himself. As you can see, he went out and bought himself a snazzy little $sign hat to display how rich he is now. So there's no more cash flow going to the government to pay G-Paw Joe. So where do they get the money? They either have to raise taxes, which most likely ain't going to happen, or they have to issue more treasuries. The deficit has to go even higher. So if this increases the deficit, by definition, the overall debt would go higher and higher and higher. And this may force the Federal Reserve to come in and do more and more quantitative easing, which pretty much takes us straight to a scenario that's a 2020 2.0. So we saw this explosion by 29% in debt. We saw an explosion of M2 money supply by 25%. And to a certain degree, that could be very similar to what we may see in the future if the government forgives the student loans. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's go over to the chart, and I want to point out something that most people don't really think about. It's low velocity money compared to high velocity money. Most of you know from watching my videos that it's not just the amount of currency units and the amount of supply, but it's how fast those currency units circulate throughout the economy. If we have very high velocity, then we'll most likely have higher rates of consumer price inflation. Low velocity, that puts downward pressure on inflation. Okay, well, if we have student Stu paying the government and then the government paying Grandpa Joe, we've got high velocity money, because this is most likely coming out of his checking account and going right into GPA Joe's checking account. So we've got high velocity money going to high velocity money. But if the government instead has to issue bonds, treasuries, that's being pulled likely out of savings. And this assumes that the Federal Reserve is not doing quantitative easing. So if they're pulling those currency units out of savings, that's very low velocity money. That isn't money that people are spending on used cars, on hamburgers, or paying their rent. So you're taking low velocity money and giving it to people. They're going to spend it very, very quickly. Okay, well, what is that going to do to the overall rate of circulation of the amount of currency units in the real economy? In other words, what is that going to do to overall velocity of money? Most likely going to increase, which puts further upward pressure on prices. And I want to remind you that the people that are paying these student loans currently are most likely the people who are impacted to the greatest degree from consumer price inflation itself. Because the rich people that can afford to pay off their student loan don't really worry about the price of gas or the price of food. But the people who are really struggling, making those student loan payments, those are the people that really feel the pinch when the price of food, the price of energy, or the price of rent goes up, which ironically is what will most likely happen if they do the student loan forgiveness. So I know a lot of you are probably saying to yourself, okay, I understand the problem, George, but what is the solution? Well, it's actually quite simple. In fact, to understand the solution better, let's cut to a clip of one of the biggest proponents of student loan forgiveness, Bernie Sanders himself.
50 years ago, what did it cost to go to the University of California? Remember?
$50,
Yeah.
500.
Virtually free. City University of New York.
Right.
Virtually free.
So isn't that amazing when he was saying, Bill, remember back in our day, college was like $5. And now it's $50,000. And he doesn't even have the intellectual curiosity to ask why. Well, Bernie, if you're watching right now, let me give you a very quick lesson in economics. You see, when we have the free market, or when we had the free market with college tuition, prices were very low. But when we added the government subsidizing the cost of tuition, so we added the government to the free market, what happened? Prices went up. So you see, Bernie's solution is just to do more of what created the problem to begin with. But my solution is just to do less. Look at the problem, analyze it, and eliminate it. Step number 3, the real problem and another real solution. So we talked about the problems with student loan forgiveness and inflation or inflationary pressures. But what we didn't discuss is the moral hazard. And I think this is just as important, if not more important. Let's think about it. We've got all these students who behaved responsibly. They produced more than they consumed. They saved their money in order to pay back that student loan debt, to fulfill the promise they made to begin with. So what happens to those individuals when you take this entire other group that may not have acted as responsibly and give them a reward for their behavior? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not saying it's all the students' fault that they have this debt, but we have to have some accountability, for heaven's sakes. No one took a gun and put it to their head and say, you have to take out this student loan debt. It was a decision they made. It needs to be their responsibility. But what this really is at the end of the day is an extension of this participation trophy type of society we have right now. You've got Johnny out there that's sacrificing everything, staying in the batting cage, practicing hours and hours and hours. And then we have his counterpart, let's say Joe, that doesn't do any practicing at all, that just stays home and plays video games, but we give them the exact same reward. What does that do to society long term? Well, we're going to get into that in just a moment. But before we do, let's also think about today's students that are in high school. So if they see everyone in college or that has gone to college not having to pay for it, well, they're going to demand the exact same thing. And the Bernie Sanders types, the AOC types, are going to give it to them. So we go from having to pay for college to most likely free college. I mean, that's the next logical step. This is the end game here. Well, actually, it's not the end game because we go to free college to pretty much everything free. That's going to transition, in my opinion, straight to UBI. And then that takes us straight into a central bank digital currency in an Orwellian nanny state. And you may be saying to yourself, okay, George, well, that'd be great if we got everything for free. But remember, there's no free lunch. If you're getting something for free, then that means someone else is paying for it. And if they're not paying for it, you are going to inevitably pay for it by the quality of what you're receiving going down. So whether it's healthcare, whether it's college, university, a house, a car, you name it. You get it for free, you get it from the government, and the quality in your standard of living is going to plummet. But before we go any further, let's address this chart. It goes back to 1970 all the way to around 2018 or so. On the left, we go from zero up to $100,000. This is the classic wage premium that you hear about all the time. So this red line represents those people in society that just graduated from high school. The green line represents those who graduated from college. So at surface level, if you just take a glance at this, you come to the conclusion that the Bernie Sanders types come to, and that's, oh my gosh, all we have to do to make everyone rich is just have them go to college. Because obviously, if they go to college, they make a lot more money. But this is a classic example of confusing correlation and causation. To illustrate this, let me tell you a quick story about my sister. She has two daughters. They would be my nieces. And I am very proud of them, to say the least. But they had an ideal upbringing. Parents were never divorced. My sister was able to stay home and make sure that they do their homework, but more importantly, make sure that she instilled in them discipline, responsibility, integrity, and a work ethic. So it is true that both my nieces went to college, and both of them today are making a lot of money. But is it because they went to college, or is it because my sister and my brother-in-law raised them well? You see, I would argue that this gap really has nothing to do with high school or nothing to do with college. That it really is about the types of people that go to college and the types of people that stay in high school or flunk out of high school. Most of you know a lot of your buddies that might have flunked out of high school. And usually, not always, but usually they were the types of people that had the personality that made them unsuccessful, maybe from a monetary standpoint, for the rest of their life or into adulthood. You see, so it's really like a self-selection process where college doesn't necessarily give the kids the skills needed to be successful, but it's an aggregator of kids who would have been successful. Why? Because their parents raised them well. So do we have too few kids in college? Absolutely not. I would argue we have too many kids in college. And if we just went back to free market capitalism, for heaven's sakes, and we just went back to an era where the only kids that went to college were the kids that really needed to learn something, like engineering, like being a doctor or a lawyer, as an example, and all the other kids went off to immediately start producing more than they consume right out of high school. You combine that with taking the focus off of college and putting it back on parenting, those are the real solutions to our problems. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.